The late-night shift at the city hospital was always quiet, but for a young mother named Clara, the silence felt heavy. She was a nurse, and she spent her nights caring for strangers, her heart always tugging her back home to her little apartment, where her 3-year-old daughter Lily would be sleeping. Lily was her whole world. A bright little girl with big, watchful eyes. She saw everything. She loved naming colors in her picture books, stacking blocks until they tumbled, and whispering secrets to her worn, floppy-eared stuffed rabbit. Her words were still simple, a mix of clear requests and charming baby talk. Money was tight, so Clara had made a difficult choice. Her boyfriend, Mark, who had been kind and patient in the beginning, had offered to watch Lily while Clara worked nights. It meant Lily could sleep in her own bed, and they could save on the crushing cost of a proper babysitter. Clara pushed down the small, nagging doubts. Mark had never been mean, just sometimes a little short-tempered when he was tired. She told herself it would be okay. One night, the quiet at the hospital was shattered by an ambulance call. Clara helped stabilize a car crash victim, her hands moving on autopilot while her mind, as it always did, drifted to Lily. She pictured her daughter curled up, one hand resting on her rabbit's ear, breathing softly in the glow of the nightlight. Her shift ended at 7 a.m., and she drove home through the gray dawn, exhaustion weighing on her bones, but a smile on her face, thinking of the morning hug she was about to receive. She let herself into the apartment. It was too quiet. "Lilybug?" She called softly, dropping her bag by the door. She walked into the small living room. Mark was on the couch, already dressed, watching TV with the sound low. He looked up, his face strangely flat. "She's still sleeping," he said, his voice even. "Had a rough night." Fell out of bed. A cold trickle of fear ran down Clara's spine. Lily had never fallen out of her toddler bed, which had a safety rail. She moved quickly down the short hallway and pushed open the door to Lily's room. The nightlight was on. Lily was lying on her back, awake, but she wasn't moving. Her rabbit was on the floor. And her left arm? It lay at an odd, sickening angle against her side, already beginning to swell with deep, terrible bruises that looked like dark shadows on her pale skin. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She rushed to the bed, her professional nurse's mind clashing violently with her mother's heart. "Oh, baby," she whispered, her voice shaking. Lily looked at her, her eyes wide and full of a pain that was more than physical. She didn't cry. She just whimpered, a small, broken sound. "Mark said you fell," Clara said, her fingers gently brushing Lily's hair. Lily just stared, then her gaze flickered toward the door, fear flashing in her eyes. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She closed her mouth into a tight line. The next hours were a blur of panic and white walls. The emergency room was busy, but the staff moved with urgent efficiency when they saw Lily's injury. Clara held her good hand, whispering nonsense songs as the doctors examined her. X-rays were taken. A kind-faced doctor with tired eyes asked Clara, in a careful, quiet tone, to step into a separate room. "A break in her arm," the doctor said, pointing to the X-ray on a light screen. "It's a spiral fracture. See how it twists?" Clara nodded, her stomach churning. "In a child this age," the doctor continued, his voice gentle but firm, "this type of injury, it doesn't usually happen from a simple fall out of bed. It takes a significant twisting force." The words hung in the air. Significant twisting force. Clara's world tilted. She thought of Mark's flat expression, his quick explanation. She thought of Lily's silent fear, her refusal to speak. A social worker was called. Gentle questions were asked, first to Clara, then, with a specialist present, to Lily. The little girl, cradling her now casted arm, would only bury her face in Clara's neck. When asked about Mark, She flinched not by that afternoon. The police were at the hospital. They spoke to Clara, reviewed the medical report. They went to the apartment. Mark was still there. Clara could hear the low, serious tones of their voices from the hallway where she waited, holding Lily. Later, she learned he was taken into custody, charged with felony child abuse. The legal machine, cold and impersonal, had begun to turn. The district attorney on the case believed they had a strong medical evidence, but to really make the charges stick, they needed a witness. The only witness was a traumatized 3-year-old girl who had stopped speaking about that night altogether. A child psychologist was assigned to help Lily. After several meetings, she had a suggestion for the prosecutor. "She's shut down. The words are locked inside because the memory is too scary," the psychologist explained. "We need to create a bridge, something safe that can carry her voice from that night into this one." The plan was unusual, but it worked before. Lily would testify in a closed courtroom, and she would not be alone on the stand. They would bring in a dog. The morning of the hearing felt different from any other morning. The air in the small apartment was thick and still. Clara helped Lily get dressed, choosing soft, comfortable clothes, a yellow sweater that was her favorite, and pants that wouldn't rub against the heavy white cast on her arm. The cast was a constant, ugly reminder. Lily had stopped asking when it would come off. She just accepted it, like a bad dream that wouldn't end. The child advocate, a woman with a calm voice named Mrs. Ellis, arrived to take them to the courthouse. She had spent the last few weeks visiting, trying to build a tiny bit of trust with Lily. "Remember, sweetheart," Mrs. Ellis said, kneeling down, "it's just a quiet room, and your friend will be there." The big, gentle dog. Lily's eyes, which had been staring at the floor, flickered upward for just a second. She clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter, its fur matted from her anxious grip. The courthouse was a building of echoing footsteps and hushed voices. Everything was too big: the doors, the hallways, the serious faces of people rushing by in suits. They were led into a small, plain room to wait. Clara's hands were cold. She tried to smile at Lily, to pour all her strength into that one look, but she felt her own face might crack. She was swimming in a sea of guilt. I left her. I trusted him. This is my fault. The thoughts were a drumbeat in her head, louder than the ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, a court officer opened a heavy wooden door. "They're ready for you," he said, his tone not unkind, but empty of any comfort. The courtroom was not like the ones on television. It was smaller, quieter, but somehow more intense. The judge sat high up behind a big desk, her glasses perched on her nose as she looked over some papers. There were a few other people in the room. A court reporter with her fingers poised over a strange little machine. Another officer by the door. And then Clara saw him. Mark. He sat at a table with a man in a suit, the defense lawyer. He was wearing a clean, button-down shirt and had gotten a haircut. He looked normal. He looked like the man who had made her laugh over coffee just a month ago. The sight made her feel dizzy. Lily saw him too. Clara felt the little girl's whole body go stiff in her arms. A tiny, frightened sound escaped her lips, and she buried her face in Clara's neck, refusing to look up. "It's okay, baby. I've got you," Clara whispered, her own voice trembling. She was guided to a chair in the front, just behind a small, special stand that had a booster seat on it for Lily. The prosecutor, a woman with a gentle face but tired eyes, began. She spoke softly to the judge, explaining the plan for the day. Then she turned her attention to Lily. "Good morning, Lily," she said, her voice like a quiet song. "Can you tell me how old you are?" Lily didn't move. Her face stayed hidden. "That's okay," the prosecutor said. "Can you show me with your fingers?" "You're such a big girl." No response. The silence in the room grew heavier. The judge watched, her expression careful and neutral. The defense lawyer scribbled a note on a pad. Mark stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. For 10 minutes, the prosecutor tried. She asked about Lily's rabbit, about her favorite color, about the cast on her arm. Each question was met with the same still, terrified silence. Lily had disappeared inside herself. Clara's heart was breaking into smaller and smaller pieces. She wanted to scream, to pick Lily up and run out of that horrible, quiet room. The psychologist's plan wasn't working. The words were too locked away. The judge let out a soft sigh. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess," she suggested. Her voice kind. It was at that exact moment, as the tension in the room had reached its peak and hope seemed to drain away, that Lily moved. Maybe it was the word recess, which she knew from the playground. Maybe she was just seeking anything in the room that wasn't a scary face or a hard question. She slowly turned her head from Clara's shoulder. Her gaze drifted across the polished wood of the floor, past the shiny shoes of the lawyers, and came to rest in the corner of the room. There, sitting calmly on a mat, was a dog. A big, yellow Labrador retriever. His name was Rex. He was lying down, his head on his paws, his brown eyes soft and watchful. Beside him sat his handler, a police officer in a uniform, a man with a kind, weathered face who sat perfectly still. Lily's eyes locked onto the dog. For the first time since entering the courtroom, the sheer panic in her face softened, replaced by a flicker of pure, simple curiosity. The animal was a living, breathing piece of something normal, something that didn't demand words from her. Slowly, still clinging to her rabbit with her good arm, Lily sat up a little straighter in Clara's lap. She lifted her small hand, the one poking out from the cast. She pointed one tiny finger directly at Rex. A murmur, quiet but distinct, traveled through the room. The judge leaned forward. The prosecutor paused, holding her breath. The defense lawyer stopped writing. Everyone followed the line of that small, pointing finger to the peaceful dog in the corner. Lily took a deep, shaky breath. And then, in a clear, high voice that sounded impossibly loud in the silent courtroom, she spoke 2 words. "He hurt." For a long moment, nobody moved. The 2 words hung in the air of the quiet courtroom, simple and heavy as stones dropped into still water. He hurt. Lily's finger was still pointing, not wavering, aimed right at the big yellow dog. The dog, Rex, just thumped his tail once on the mat, his gentle eyes watching the little girl. The prosecutor was the first to break the silence. She took a slow step closer, careful not to startle Lily. Her voice was softer than a whisper. "The dog is hurt, sweetheart?" Lily shook her head, a quick, frustrated little motion. Her brow furrowed. The adults weren't understanding. She wasn't talking about the dog. She was talking to him. The dog was safe. The dog listened and didn't get angry. She looked right into Rex's calm face and said it again, a little louder, her small voice firm. "He hurt." Then something even more startling happened. Lily turned her head. Slowly, as if pulled by a force she couldn't control, she shifted her gaze away from the safe, furry animal in the corner. Her eyes traveled across the room, over the shiny table, past the pens and papers, and landed on the man sitting there. Mark. She didn't point at him. She didn't have to. The connection was made, clear as a line drawn in the sand. She had spoken her truth to the dog, and then she had looked at the source of her fear. Her message was complete. A sharp sound came from the defense table. Mark's lawyer had dropped his pen. The man's face was a mask of professional calm, but his eyes were wide. Mark himself seemed to freeze. The neutral, blank expression he had worn all morning vanished. His face drained of color, and for just a second, his eyes met Lily's. In that flash, Clara saw it not anger, but a shocking, raw panic. It was the look of someone whose secret had just been spoken out loud in the most undeniable way. The judge adjusted her glasses, leaning forward. Let the record note that the child has verbally stated he hurt. While looking at the accused, she said, her tone measured but intense. She then looked at the child psychologist, who was sitting near Mrs. Ellis. Doctor, can you help us understand what is happening here? The psychologist stood up. She didn't walk to the center. She stayed where Lily could see her easily, not wanting to block the girl's view of her safe anchor, the dog. Your Honor, what we are seeing is a common coping mechanism in very young trauma victims. It's called displacement. The memory and the feelings are too big, too scary, to attach directly to the person who caused them. So, the child finds a safer outlet. Lily isn't accusing the dog. She is using his presence as a bridge. She feels safe enough with the facility dog to voice the words she has been carrying, but she cannot yet point directly at the person she fears. She has, however, made the connection visually for all of us to see. The defense lawyer jumped to his feet. Objection. This is speculation. The child pointed at a dog and said 2 vague words. This is not direct testimony against my client. The judge thought for a moment. Overruled. The witness is an expert explaining observed behavior. The context is relevant. I will allow it. She turned back to the prosecutor. You may proceed, but gently. See if the bridge she has built can carry any more weight. The prosecutor nodded. She looked at Lily, who had turned back to face Rex, her body already relaxing a fraction now that the terrible words were out. Lily, the prosecutor said, is Rex a good boy? Lily gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. Can you tell Rex a secret? Can you tell him if the hurt happened at night, when the lights were off? Lily pressed her lips together, looking at the dog. She nodded again, just once. Can you tell Rex if the hurt happened in your room? Another small nod. A tear escaped Clara's eye, tracing a warm path down her cheek. Her baby was talking. Not to them, but through the kind, silent creature who asked for nothing in return. The prosecutor asked a few more simple, careful questions, all directed to be answered to the dog. Was it when Mommy was at work? Did she have her rabbit? With each question, Lily would either give a small nod or shake her head, her eyes fixed on Rex. She patted her own cast gently. The story, in its most basic form, was being told. A story of hurt in her room at night, when she was alone with him. Mark no longer looked panicked. He looked hollow. He stared down at his own hands clasped on the table, as if he didn't recognize them. The performance of the innocent man was gone. In its place was a weary, awful stillness. The judge called for a short recess. As people began to move, the police officer who was Rex's handler gave a quiet command. The big Labrador stood up, stretched, and with his handler, walked slowly and calmly across the room. They didn't go to the door. They walked right up to the little stand where Lily sat. Rex stopped a few feet away, his tail wagging slowly. With a courage that made Clara's heart ache, Lily slid off Clara's lap. Still holding her rabbit, she took 2 small steps forward. She stretched out her small hand, the fingers poking from the cast, and touched the top of the dog's broad, warm head. Rex leaned into the touch, just a little dot in that simple contact. In a quiet courtroom surrounded by broken trust and painful truth, a little girl found a moment of peace. She had said the unsayable, and she had been believed. The mood in the courtroom had shifted completely. The heavy, stuck feeling was gone, replaced by a new kind of tension, a buzzing energy of what might happen next. The short recess was called, but nobody really left. Lily stayed close to Rex, her small hand resting on his back as he sat calmly beside her. The big dog's presence was like a warm, living blanket. And for the first time since that terrible night, The tight fear in her shoulders began to loosen. Just a little, Clara watched, her emotions a tangled knot. There was a piercing pride for her daughter's bravery, a deep, sorrowful grief for what had been stolen from her, and a burning anger that simmered beneath it all. But as she watched Lily whisper something into the dog's fur, a tiny bit of hope, fragile as a soap bubble, began to form. Her daughter had found her voice. Over in the corner, the defense lawyer was having a hurried, intense conversation with his client. The man's earlier confidence was fraying. His client, Mark, was not helping. Mark sat slumped in his chair, not looking at anyone. He wasn't crying or causing a scene. He just looked emptied out, like all the fight had been drained from him by a little girl's two simple words and the honest, quiet nods that followed. The lawyer's arguments about vague statements and speculation suddenly felt thin and weak against the powerful. Silent movie everyone had just witnessed. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, something else was happening. The prosecutor, a woman who had seen many difficult cases, felt a new sense of purpose. Lily's testimony had been a crack in the dam. She needed more. She made a quick call from the hallway, her voice low but urgent. "I need you to recanvass the apartment building," she said to the detective on the case. "Focus on the neighbors again. Now that he's been formally charged and there's been a hearing, someone might remember something they thought was unimportant. Press them. Ask about that specific night." Back inside, the recess ended. The judge took her seat, her eyes thoughtful as she looked at Lily, who was now back on Clara's lap, but still watching Rex. The defense lawyer stood up. He tried to go back on the attack, questioning the child psychologist again, trying to pick apart the idea of displacement. But his heart wasn't in it. The story was too clear, too emotionally true. It was like trying to argue that the sun wasn't warm. Just as the lawyer was finishing another technical question, the main door to the courtroom opened quietly. A court officer walked in and handed a single piece of paper to the prosecutor. She read it, and her eyes went wide for a second before she composed herself. She leaned over and whispered to her assistant, then stood up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with a new certainty. "With the court's permission, we have just received new, corroborating evidence. A neighbor in the apartment building has come forward with home security camera footage from the night in question." A sharp gasp came from the defense table. Mark's head snapped up. This was a detail he hadn't considered the ordinary, modern eye of a security camera watching a balcony. "The footage is time-stamped," the prosecutor continued. "It shows the balcony of the defendant's apartment. At the exact time window consistent with Lily's medical report, the footage shows the defendant, alone, out on that balcony. His body language is visibly agitated. He is seen pacing, running his hands through his hair, and at one point he appears to shout something in clear frustration before slamming his hand down on the railing. He is out there for approximately 12 minutes before going back inside." The prosecutor let that sink in. This places the defendant in a state of high agitation, alone, at the precise time the child suffered a severe, inflicted injury inside that same apartment. It directly supports the testimony we have just heard. The room was utterly silent. The camera footage wasn't a smoking gun showing the act itself. It was something almost more powerful. It showed the context. It showed the emotional state, the opportunity, and the timeline. It wrapped around Lily's whispered testimony to the dog and sealed it shut. The judge turned to the defense lawyer. "Does the defense have any questions regarding this new evidence?" The lawyer looked at his client. Mark had put his head in his hands. He was defeated, and it was obvious. The lawyer knew that trying to fight this now, in front of a judge who had seen Lily's bravery, would only make things worse. The little girl and the quiet dog had done more than any aggressive cross-examination ever could. They had shown the truth, and the truth had left no room for lies. Your Honor, the defense lawyer said, his voice tight. Given the developments, we request a brief adjournment to consult with our client. The judge nodded. We will adjourn for 1 hour. She looked at Lily, and her stern expression softened, just for a moment. And I would suggest that the facility dog be available in the waiting area. He seems to be a great comfort. As people filed out, Clara held Lily close. She felt a tremor of relief, but it was a cautious one. The fight wasn't over, but the ground had shifted. The wall of silence and doubt that Mark had hidden behind had crumbled, brick by brick. First, by a child's voice speaking to a kind animal. And second, by the unblinking, digital memory of a camera that had caught a moment of rage under the night sky dot in the quiet hallway. The police officer led Rex over to them. Lily reached out again, and the dog licked her fingers. In that simple, messy, loving gesture, Clara saw a new path forward. The journey to justice was still happening, but the journey to healing, for the first time, had truly begun. The 1-hour adjournment stretched into an afternoon of quiet waiting. In a small, sunlit room reserved for families, away from the echoing halls of the courthouse, Lily finally let go. Not of her mother's hand, but of a terrible, coiled tension she had carried for weeks. With Rex the yellow lab lying like a gentle rug on the floor beside her, she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, her head on Clara's lap, her good hand still resting on the dog's warm fur. For Clara, watching her daughter sleep without a frown or a whimper was its own kind of healing. It was the first proof that peace was still possible. When they were called back into the courtroom, the atmosphere was different. The sharp, anxious edge was gone. The defense lawyer stood and spoke to the judge in a low, respectful tone. Your Honor, after reviewing the evidence and consulting at length with my client, we wish to change our plea. Mark stood beside him, looking smaller somehow. He did not look at Clara or Lily. He stared at a spot on the floor as his lawyer continued. The defendant wishes to plead guilty to the charge of felony child endangerment, causing serious bodily injury. A full, formal trial, with its weeks of testimony and painful details, would not happen. Lily would not have to sit in this room again. The system, which often moves with a slow, grinding weight, had shifted swiftly. The combination of Lily's unforgettable testimony and the damning security footage had created a truth too solid to challenge. The judge accepted the plea, her voice firm as she set a date for sentencing. Justice, in the legal sense, was now a matter of procedure. But this story was never just about a sentence. It was about a little girl's broken arm and her even more broken sense of safety. It was about a mother's guilt and a long road back to trust. The legal ending was just one chapter closing. The real story began in the weeks and months that followed. Clara found a new apartment, a small place with bright windows and a landlord who was a kind older woman. It felt like a fresh start. Lily's cast eventually came off, revealing an arm that was thinner and paler than the other. The physical healing was straightforward. The other healing, the kind inside her heart, was slower. This is where Rex and his handler, the police officer with the kind eyes, came back into their lives. It wasn't part of the court case anymore. It was something more human. The officer, who had seen so much pain in his job, had been deeply moved by the little girl and her 2 words. He asked Clara, through the child psychologist, if it would be all right for him and Rex to visit sometimes, informally. Just as friends, the first visit was at the new apartment. When the doorbell rang, Lily hid behind Clara's legs. But when she saw the big yellow dog waiting patiently in the hallway, his tail wagging a slow, happy beat, she peeked out. The officer didn't come in all the way. He just smiled and said, I think Rex missed you. Would it be okay if he said hello? Lily nodded. Rex walked in, sat, and offered a paw. Lily took it, and a tiny smile, The first genuine one Clara had seen in so long. Touched her lips. The visits became a routine. Sometimes they'd meet at a park. The officer would throw a ball, and Rex would bound after it, bringing it back not to him, but to drop it carefully at Lily's feet. Lily learned to throw with her once broken arm, her strength growing with each toss. She didn't talk much about the bad things. She talked to the dog. "Look, Rex, a butterfly," she would say. Or, "This grass is tickly." She was rebuilding her voice, word by simple word, speaking them into a listening, non-judgmental ear. Clara watched this friendship blossom and felt a piece of her own guilt begin to mend. She saw that the world still held kindness, that it wasn't all sharp edges and scary rooms. She started attending a support group for parents, and slowly, she learned to forgive herself for trusting the wrong person. One sunny afternoon, several months later, they met at the Children's Advocacy Center, a place designed to be soft and safe. It had a playroom with giant cushions and walls, painted like a meadow. Rex had become a sort of unofficial mascot there. On this day, Lily was in the middle of the room, and Rex was lying nearby, chewing contentedly on a special rubber toy. The psychologist was present, but she was just watching from the side, letting the moment unfold. Lily picked up a soft, blue ball. She looked at the dog. She didn't point. Pointing was for a courtroom, for identifying a source of fear. This was different. "Rex," she called, her voice clear and sure. "Get the ball." She threw it. It didn't go far, just a few wobbly feet across the colorful carpet. Rex lifted his head, his tail thumping. He looked at the ball, then at Lily, then at his handler. The officer gave a slight nod. The big dog stood up, walked over with calm purpose, and gently picked up the blue ball in his mouth. He didn't bring it to the officer. He walked right back to Lily and placed it in her outstretched hands. Lily giggled. A real, bubbling, joyful sound that filled the sunny room. She hugged the dog around his neck, and he stood patiently, accepting the love. Clara, watching from the doorway with tears in her eyes, understood. The startling moment in the courtroom, the pointed finger, the two words, that wasn't the end of the story. It was the necessary, difficult beginning. It was the first crack in the wall of silence. Everything that came after the guilty plea, the new home, these quiet afternoons, was the healing. That little girl, once so scared she could only speak to a dog, was now laughing with him. She had used his calm strength to find her own voice again. And now she was using that voice not to name a hurt, but to play a game, to give a command, to simply be a child. The journey wasn't over, but they were on the right path, walking it one soft ball throw, one quiet visit, one trusting hug at a time.